be here to moderate this next panel. My name is Melanie Hauenstein. I'm the UNDP resident representative here in Lebanon. I'm in week 4 of my assignment here, and I'm extremely delighted and grateful to AUB and the Urban Lab and to Mona for having invited me to moderate this panel, because I understand we have a whole group of young researchers who will present us today the platform that they have built. And this is an excellent opportunity for me to learn, but also to see how we can build on what was discussed this morning, to see how we use these platforms, how we use data to inform decision making, to increase transparency, to provide analysis, and to provide analysis for always checking in, and we have been doing that in the United Nations Development Program. We have strengthened that over the last 5 to 10 years to always see how we evaluate our interventions and how we adapt, so that we can really learn and that we can really adapt it to the context and work on a people-centered approach. I think it's also very important for advocacy, and I think data is important to show sometimes the hidden facts, I think what is not obvious, and to bring that to the fore. So we have today 7, as I understand, researchers. So we have with us Haifa, Luna, Antoine, Soha, Leila, Isabella, and Abir. And I hand over to them shortly, and I'm told they will self-moderate. They will go one after the other, and each one present for 10 minutes. And then I'm very delighted to have David Ahoud from the Lebanese American University, who will come in afterwards as a discussant to comment. And as I prepared for this moderation of the panel, and I think that draws on what you have discussed this morning, I thought it would be good to draw on more on how we can use these platforms and the data, what Mona has said at the end of the last panel, to work more with municipality and help them to do better planning, better decision making, to see how the evidence that these platforms generate can help us to inform our decisions, what I've said at the beginning, and I also look forward to hearing your thoughts on that. And then I think for me, one of the important issues, I visited, I think 10 days ago, Karantina, and I talked a lot to some of the people affected by the blast, but also supported by all of us. And I think what is important there is how we can bring this knowledge back to these people. And I think that is then really the next step in a people-centered and empowered approach to reconstruction, but also to development. So I very much look forward to your thoughts, and I have here Haifa, who will start, but Leila will start. Okay, so Leila, please, over to you, and thank you very much for having me here today.
Thank you. Hello, everyone. So I will be introducing today the knowledge platforms which are being produced at the Beirut Urban Lab. So during the ongoing crisis, the Beirut Urban Lab has been producing multiple knowledge platforms in response to the multiple wars, pandemic, disaster, financialization of land, and dysfunctional urban governance. These multiple crises function at multiple levels, and each will be tackled as a knowledge platform on its own that will be presented today. So we start this panel by tackling the crisis of memory, amnesia, and history, along with archive. And today, more than ever, we need to reconciliate with the past, get in touch with our archives, and give the voice for the marginalized groups to reveal their concealed narrative. The archive is crucial in producing knowledge, to share it, and to use it as a step towards recovery. We then move with my colleague Luna to another crisis, the crisis of COVID-19, which reveals that responses to this pandemic operate through ongoing negotiations over the national territory. We map the sectarian political system through governing the pandemic in Lebanon. We will end the panel by two major databases. So the former is the Beirut Built Environment Database, known as the BBED, and the Beirut Urban Observatory. The former provides a shared base of information for and about Beirut and serves as a basis for ongoing theorization of urban transformation, including the rising rates of vacancies, forced evictions, developers' trajectories, environmental justice, and existing financialization of land and its impact on everyday life in the city. The latter is the Beirut Urban Observatory, which builds on the Beirut Built Environment Database, and the project was initiated just a few months after the blast. It produces and disseminates maps and visual data about ongoing repairs and recovery processes. It supports an integrated and inclusive framework of urban recovery. But all the following projects are under the knowledge platforms, and they all use visualization and mapping as a tool for learning and research. So I will be discussing two major projects today under archiving and unarchiving the city. The first is the Levant Carta, and the second is the Imagining the Recovery of Karantina. So these two projects function as two data platforms and can be considered as a knowledge production engine. But most importantly, they believe in a fair distribution of access and recognition. These projects experiment with the notion of archive and how we can democratize it and expand its notion of authorship. We experiment here with two concepts. First, archiving, and second, unarchiving. The former is about maps, top to bottom approach, master plans, archaeology, and the latter is about counter-narrative, oral history, and personal archives. Levant Carta is a project initiated by Rice University, and the Beirut Urban Lab took custody of the Levant Carta in 2019 from the Spatial Lab, and since then we have been working with Dr. Faris al-Dahdah to grow the platform. It uses multiple research methods to cross-reference historical data. We validate maps, unify them, georeference historical maps, and archive through multiple methods of warping. We narrate the city through multi-layered media. The platform is an open source, meaning it's accessible by all users, and we are now working on making the platform a user-fed engine where anyone can upload their archival material. To develop this data, we cross-reference literary works describing historical buildings, their date of demolition, their date of construction, their political context, their social context. We also cross-reference with photographs, maps, and architectural drawing. Therefore, the interactive map that you see now is the result of cross-referencing multiple data we have. Also, you can navigate the platform per era. We can go back way in history to the Greco-Roman period. We can also see how we can warp some historical maps to do a vertical layering of the city. We can also use the slider to navigate across time. The second project will expand on the notion of authorship and archiving and believe that personal archives and narratives are crucial for narrating the history of the city. We are currently working on this project, Imagining the Recovery of Karantina, and we see it as an important layer of oral history for Beirut, but also should aim for future recovery projects. But why Karantina? Because Karantina is confined by natural and infrastructural edges that separate it from the rest of the city. Karantina's built environment is an overlap of ongoing traumas, historical evolution, spatial practices, and built fabric that was further damaged by the port's blast of August 4, 2020. Today, Karantina is stigmatized, silenced, and excluded from participating in the narrative of the city, neither in the process of city as archive, nor in the process of recovery as unarchiving. Believing that part of recovery is building a communal archive and that anchoring the stories of the marginalized group is important in recovery, we developed this interactive platform that can be accessed by the public. We also worked with local researchers who are residents of Karantina, previously trained by the BUL.
أصلاً الخلاني هون ربياني هون بحب المنطقة ولا نهار يعني فكرت دائما من المنطقة حتى تجوزت قعدت هون أهلي كانوا هون.
Archive here can be a step towards an alternative tool in planning and can build a repertoire for the vision and future accounting for the memory of a place, but most importantly, it gives insights on how to rebuild knowing our history and countering the notion of planning through erasure and tabula rasa, while recognizing amnesia as a crisis. I would like to thank the lab directors and my colleagues who worked extensively to make these two platforms work. And I will give now the floor to Luna. Thank you.
Thank you, Leila. Of course, amnesia is not the only crisis. Lebanon is always the site of multiple and overlapping crises that are more or less violent and disruptive. With the BBED platform, which you will hear about shortly with my colleagues, the lab had been addressing the financialization of the built environment and its dire impact on housing, services, public spaces, and mobility. But with the pandemic in March 2020, we turned our attention to the health crisis. We were struck by the rapidity by which sectarian political elites mobilized to respond to the crisis and deployed an arsenal of interventions across their strongholds. We also noted the responses by solidarity groups we had already identified during the 2019 uprisings. We thus designed a research project to map the range of actors engaged in the COVID-19 response. And the dashboard we produced also aims at injecting a different reading of the pandemic into a dominant statistical media landscape. The dashboard also provides a simultaneous representation of information at multiple geographic scales and interactive navigation of data layers, both spatially and across time. The dashboard shows a variety of actors' responses to the pandemic. We grouped them into two groups. The first one adopted a top-down approach and includes sectarian groups, political parties, political foundations, religious actors, governmental actors, in addition to international organizations. The second group of actors leans more toward bottom-up approaches and adopts a set of values that is less clientelistic than the first and is more inclusive and solidarity-based. This includes INGOs, NGOs, university actors, campaigns, collectives, and some private sector. In the dashboard, we recorded and visualized three types of variables: the type of actors and the type of response and the location of response, as you can see in the slide. Some of the responses include aid and relief, medical services, agriculture, moral support, and shelter support, etc. Actors' responses can be explored across different scales, such as muhafaza, qada, and localities. And there's an option to zoom in on specific areas across the Lebanese territory, such as Nabatiyya. We also visualized three maps. One is political parties' responses, another is total actors' responses, and the third is the types of responses. You have an option here to zoom in for detailed information about each action, and the type of response here by the municipality is prevention, which means they set up entry points at the village to monitor people coming in and out. Here you can see that the sectarian political parties map also includes a timeline that includes all the actors' responses spatially and across time. This is recorded over a period of 6 months and shows well how the sectarian political parties' response was prompt and extensive. It is also possible to explore all this data through graphs and diagrams that show the total number of responses for each category and across different scales. This dashboard is based on a data set of 538 entries compiled from available data using social media such as Facebook, Instagram, and Twitter, and media outlets such as TV, newspapers, and e-zines, and more rarely we relied on personal observations on the ground. We searched for English and Arabic keywords on social media and online, such as quarantine, corona, PCR test, and for actors operating within a mutual aid framework, we searched for words such as collective, solidarity, support network, etc. Furthermore, we searched the social media and websites of all formal actors, as you can see here. This data was then inserted into an Excel sheet and subjected to several rounds of data cleaning. We included categories that specify location, actors, the type of actors, and response, source of information, and the type of the source. The plan was to continue updating this data set and to seek funding that could support a project that could further monitor vaccination processes, especially across vulnerable territories. However, the port blast interrupted this ambition and the project was discontinued. However, the methodology is set for anyone who is keen on developing this agenda further and using it. One of the key findings of this platform, as you can see, was that the sectarian-dominated top-down response forms about 2/3 of the interventions to the pandemic, while the non-sectarian, more solidarity-based response forms about 1/3 of the action. The following map marks the location of all sectarian political parties, and the chart shows the quantities of their actions across muhafazas. As you can see, in Mount Lebanon, we documented the highest amount of responses by 8 different political parties, with the Free Patriotic Movement dominating most of them. Indeed, the visible territorialization and hegemony of the sectarian response did not go unchallenged. This map shows all responses by various actors and provides a comparative reading of the data by quantity, type, and location across multiple geographic scales. By zooming into Beirut, for example, we can identify a total of 47 responses by top-down actors versus 24 responses by bottom-up actors. This reveals that there are territories of hegemony and territories of solidarity happening in overlapping scales. In the chart, we note that top-down actors dominated prevention measures and setting up quarantine centers, for example, while the bottom-up actors focused on other types of responses, such as agriculture, aid and relief, and shelter support. If you would like to know more, we reflected on this work in a paper that has been published with the Middle East Law and Governance Journal, which you can access online at the moment. We were also invited to discuss this paper in a podcast if you would rather listen to the analysis. And in closing, as Dr. Muna Harib noted this morning, we're building on this project's methodology in a current ongoing project developed with the partnership of the TPI. And we're mapping and analyzing actors that have responded to the port blast in the neighborhoods affected by the explosion. I thank the lab directors Ahmed Muna and Muna Fawaz and the research team, which is me, and the visualization from Noor Zoghbir, Sharif Tarhini, and Ismail Ahtet. I now give the floor to Isabella Serhan, who will present the BBED, which is another knowledge platform. Thank you.
So, in the context of ongoing crises, we point to the ongoing discussions on the financialization of land in Beirut and transforming land into property or real estate, a valued asset ready for sale far from serving its social purpose, particularly shelter in the form of housing. Sorry, but I'm fixing something here. Okay. So the post-Civil War years have witnessed a heavy influx of capital, incentivized by national laws and regulations, that's facilitated its penetration in the real estate sector. That, along with circulating rumors of banks and investment companies heavily injecting capital into the development sector, raises questions of where and how is this financialization materializing in Beirut. While evidence exists in the plethora of large construction sites and cranes, high-end development, and empty apartments in the city, research on financialization was impeded by the difficulty of accessing available records and lack of data. The Beirut Urban Lab's response to this ongoing crisis comes in the form of building a database. The Beirut Built Environment Database serves as a base for research and theorization about ongoing urban transformations, particularly in the context of financialization. In the absence of a reliable map for municipal Beirut, the first task for the team was developing an accurate georeference-based map of the city. This was done in collaboration with the National Council for Scientific Research. The team consolidated available maps with cadastral maps, up-to-date aerial photography, and direct surveys to verify discrepancies and produce the final base map. The map includes parcels, building footprints, and other layers, and is free to share and download on the BUL website. In addition to building the map, the team obtained a list of all building permits filed at the Order of Engineers and Architects between 1996 and 2018. This list became the starting point to investigate building activity in Beirut over the study period. A team of 10 surveyors used this data to survey the 2,692 lots where building permits have been filed during this period, but we did not know whether development there had actually happened. Additional information was gathered for the 1,634 residential developments identified on site. Data collected includes social, physical, and environmental attributes for each of these buildings. The information was later logged on mobile apps linked to an online repository which the BUL team used to consolidate the data on the GIS base map as layers. What you see here is the BBED interactive platform as it exists today online, which you can explore. The platform brings together the surveyed indicators about actors, for example, building developers, landowners, as well as spatial and environmental characteristics, such as vacancies, number of floors, parkings, water, greenery, infrastructure lines, among other layers. This can inform ongoing research, public policy making, and advocacy about the city. The team updates the platform regularly as new data becomes available with time and through additional surveys, as mentioned before. This is an ongoing project. The BBED is expanding its scope. The methodology and platform that was developed by the team are now being used by researchers beyond Beirut to study urbanization patterns and transformations happening in peripheral areas. Coming back to the city, coming back to Beirut, this timeline shows the distribution of building permits filed between 1996 and 2018 in Beirut. So you can see how the building activity progressed. To understand how and where the penetration of capital in the real estate sector has materialized through this urban production, the BBED team zoomed in on two aspects of financialization. First, who are the drivers of this urban production? That is, who constitutes the city's growth machine? And second, what are the repercussions on the fabric of the city? To unbundle the growth machine, the BBED conducted an in-depth investigation on building developers active in Beirut between 1996 and 2018. The methodology of the growth machine rests on mapping networks these developers have cultivated to organize their operations and facilitate their development activity. This facilitation takes two forms. First, access to ingredients for a successful business, namely land, financing, permitting, and/or clients. And second, influencing the regulatory framework that organizes the real estate sector to increase the flow of money, allow for more intensive building, and reduce taxation. To do that, the team mapped all visible connections that link developer to political figures, banks, public agencies like the DGU, the municipality, and religious or philanthropic institutions. This was done through thorough online investigation of media outlets, commercial registers, and social media platforms, and later consolidated with the developer database we had built earlier. So what are these developers building? What is this flow of capital producing in Beirut? Through mapping building developers, we see a clear reproduction of established sectarian geographies in Beirut, which is far from the notion that capital investment in real estate promotes departure or is away from existing segmentations in the housing market. Moreover, further mapping shows that housing production is heavily concentrated. The sector is dominated by a handful of powerful, well-established developers who have built a very large footprint in the city over the last 25 years. In fact, 30 of the 999 identified developers have collectively built over 30% of the total area built in Beirut during this period. To contrast that number, the same area has been built by the 600 developers who built the least. So you can see how it's actually very concentrated. This map here shows, in red, the concentration of high-end developments in affluent neighborhoods in Beirut. These developments house what is termed as luxurious housing units, large in size and sold at a high price point. These developments represent 17% of the built housing units in the city, 17% of the available produced housing stock. And the survey revealed that around 50% of these developments remains empty. That is, Development activity has not responded to a demand for affordable housing, but provided an oversupply of luxurious apartments which serve as assets to attract investment, especially foreign capital. More evidence of this segmentation of the housing market appeared when the team mapped the subsidized housing loans in blue, given by the Public Corporation for Housing, overlaid with the high-end developments showed earlier in the map. This proves that middle-income families have not been capable of penetrating a very large segment of the housing market and stock of apartments produced over the 25 years. To end, it's important to point out that financialization materializes very clearly in affluent and more expensive neighborhoods in the city, but it is not limited to high-end development. This map here shows vacancy, and that vacancy is prevalent, albeit in varying proportion, in all the neighborhoods of Beirut. All these layers of information and more allowed the BBED team to conduct more in-depth research and zoom in on other aspects of financialization to further understand the changing landscape of the built environment and its repercussions in Beirut. More on that will follow in my colleagues' presentations.
So most discussions of financializations typically focus on new development, as mentioned by Isabella, because they're highly visible with their imposing footprint. These developments are nonetheless not the only materialization of financialization in today's Beirut. Less visible yet very common are urban clusters placed on hold in anticipation of future development. The platform we're presenting seeks to shed light on another aspect of contemporary urbanization in today's Beirut called urban precarity. Using precarity as a key concept, we refer to first uncertainty about the future, a condition of anxious anticipation of a future development, whether it's related to a planned road or a private development, and second, the dilapidation in which residents dwell because they are discouraged, prevented, or simply unable to repair a block that is expected to be demolished. In adopting a notion of precarity, we're shifting the focus on rising poverty, on vulnerability, and on marginality towards the urban fabric that needs to be studied as an integral element of the making of this poverty, particularly in the context where intensive capital flows were channeled into the city's buildings. So we're therefore highlighting the urban processes as critical elements of the making of areas in the city threatened with future uncertainty. In the current context, since future developments have been postponed till after the crisis, many of these areas are being reshaped as temporary residential settlements. We particularly focus on how residents dwell in these clusters and how they negotiate their presence in today's Beirut. By raising questions about what makes an urban fabric precarious, this project aimed to shift attention away from classic analysis of poverty as a measurement of what people lack, and instead analyze how uncertainty is inscribed in the organization of the built environment. The platform shows that housing precarity is linked to city-scale urban processes and local factors. In what follows, we present first several entry points for identifying precarity at the scale of the city. The platform then dives into actual case studies where narratives of urban precarity unfold with the background of citywide trends. The platform we're presenting will actually soon be online, and it's also actually expanding by contributions from current students of the architecture and the urban planning and design department. Among the identified sites of precarity are Palestinian refugee camps, urban informal settlements, and neighborhoods historically developed as refugee housing. Precarity here is the outcome of what is perceived as a temporary access to land, since camps are rented and informal settlements are tolerated. Precarity is exacerbated because the only way in which a person can build in these sites is in violation of zoning and building laws, which means that from the beginning, one's presence in the city is criminalized. Given the large number of refugees and migrant workers whose presence and labor is also largely criminalized in Lebanon, one sees the overlap of conditions that renders these areas precarious. And for example, here we mentioned the kafala system. Another form of precarity is generated by predatory development practices. we see them very visibly on the survey of the BBED, which identified cases of imminent displacement where building permits were filed, but old buildings remain in place, often housing a few households awaiting eviction. The BBED also showed the demolition permits where buildings still stood in place. It is worth noting that although we might believe the current crisis caused a pause in real estate development activities, many property owners are still trying to maximize profit on these clusters by demanding higher rent from residents who lack backing, sometimes, for example, asking for fresh US dollars from Syrian refugees living in extremely dilapidated conditions. Urban precarity is also created by the imminent remains of modern planning projects, particularly planned road projects put on hold during the Civil War or even later. Some of the roads planned and slated for expropriation in Beirut have been in limbo for 70 years. Neither was the road implemented nor was the project cancelled. Sometimes expropriations are partial and residents are unsure whether they will be displaced or not. Either way, they're not allowed to repair their homes. As a result, the clusters crumble, those who can leave rent out to lower income residents, and conditions become slowly intolerable to most. One of those cases is the Hayat Tamlis neighborhood, which became one of entrenched poverty because of an unimplemented planned road. Landowners have not received compensations to leave, and they're unable to repair their homes. Finally, precarity can be triggered or exacerbated by sudden events and disasters. The most recent one is the Beirut port explosion. Almost one-third of the city's urban fabric was affected by the port explosion. Repair and assistance schemes adopted by relief agencies lacked adequate standards and coordination. The state was also absent. Furthermore, around 1,500 buildings in these areas suffered severe structural damage and remain unrepaired. Some of these buildings are still occupied today, since their residents have nowhere else to go. Together, all of these citywide processes generate an uncertainty towards the future, an urban precarity that operates at multiple scales and with different intensities. To understand better how this precarity unravels on the actual fabric of the cluster and the lives of these residents, we conducted an in-depth analysis of housing snapshots across different neighborhoods in Beirut. Haifa will now detail the research methodology and will tell you more about one of the investigated scenarios.
That's fine. Okay, so the research adopted a two-tiered methodological approach. First, as outlined by my colleague Soha, a systematic analysis allowed us to identify at the scale of the city locations where larger-scale urban trends point to potential precarity. Second, we decided to study up from case studies or cluster stories we collected narratives that can be stitched back to the city. We therefore identified blocks where buildings are dilapidated and residents recognized a strong uncertainty towards the future. In each of these cases, we paid close attention to the power relations organized around property law in producing precarious property relations. We therefore dived into property records, extracted data from in-depth interviews, conducted informal conversations with the residents, and observed the neighborhoods closely to understand how the structure of property ownership was influencing the threat of displacement and preventing repair. So we mapped our cases of urban precarity on an interactive website, as you can see, where each story can be explored individually. Site visitors can also navigate between different cases across neighborhoods and intersecting them with the wider trends. Okay, now let me recount one of the precarity narratives that we identified. The story I will share is a cluster of 6 severely dilapidated buildings that has fallen prey to competing real estate interests. Buildings were acquired by 2 competing developers who are renting them out temporarily until the redevelopment opportunity arises. The cluster is located in an area that was developed historically as an affordable housing subdivision to house Armenian refugees in the 1930s.
It is commonly known as Camp Hajin. Since then, the neighborhood has acted as an area of refuge for many low-income groups in the city. Prior to the Civil War, it housed, next to Armenian families, numerous rural migrants who needed to work in areas nearby. So the story followed population flows in the Civil War, seeing forced evictions and population swaps until the mid-1990s, when property was recovered by original owners. However, new residents also arrived, particularly impoverished tenants who found here affordable housing. So how did a neighborhood seen as an exceptional affordable area fall prey to speculative interests? The first property transaction in the post-war era was initiated here in 2006. At the time, two brothers, goldsmiths by profession, aspired to become developer and benefit from what was then seen as Beirut's real estate property boom. The brothers began hence to acquire property in the studied block. In 2007, an established electronics company also began to purchase lots in the cluster, hoping to build its headquarters. And as of 2007, the two parties, the brothers and the company, compete over properties they seek to purchase from the inheritors of the lots. By 2012, the company had succeeded to buy 3 additional lots in the cluster, including a lot developed for low-income evangelic Armenians. The blasts were conducted by INGOs and local Armenian institutions. However, most residents expressed dissatisfaction with repairs, describing them as inadequate both structurally and internally. Almost all tenants have recently received notices of rent increases and are threatened with eviction if they are unable to pay the additional fees or pay even in dollars. Tenants believe that the post-blast repairs are used as an excuse for landlords to increase rent and threaten them. Stories such as this reveal the deep transformation that Beirut has seen. So next to earlier mapping we saw with Isabella, where we see financialization materialize with vacant buildings replacing occupied smaller ones, this project reveals 2 additional aspects of financialization. In some way, the story gives us a glimpse of the history of what happened in the areas before the development, how life was, and how displacement may have taken place. The research also reveals an invisible layer of financialization. A city living in the anticipation of the future of vacant buildings, residents waiting to be evicted, living in poor conditions because property owners still anticipate a profit that is yet to come.
Okay. You have to bear with me because I was a bit sick for the past 2 days. Okay, the narrative that Haifa recounted introduces another aspect of precarity that we have not yet touched on, the question of rent in Beirut. In spite of the political mantra that aggressively favored home ownership since the mid-1990s as part of a strategy to facilitate the circulation of capital in the built environment, as explained by Isabella, rent remains one of the main channels of housing acquisition in Beirut. Indeed, at least half of Beirut's residents, including migrant workers, refugees, and mostly low and middle-income Lebanese families, of whom a few still benefit from rent control for the next few years, rent out the homes in which they dwell. Yet, as Haifa and Suha showed us earlier, beneath the high reliance on rent to access housing in Beirut is multiple layers of fragile tenure conditions and an intractable and ongoing crisis in rental housing. The high demand for rent was met by an increasingly limited supply of rental units, particularly given that most new buildings developed after 1996 do not offer rent as an option of shelter acquisition as the old ones did. As a result, and with the heavy real estate activity over the past 30 years, every new development typically eliminates at least few units that had been part of the city's rental stock. Worse, rental arrangements are clouded, so it's unclear on what terms people agree, and enforcement mechanisms are weak, whereby landlords come to evict or ask for a raise, while tenants don't really know where they can find recourse. All of this falls perfectly in line with Lebanon's national traditions, where nobody really knows what the actual size of demand is, nor is there sufficient visibility on how asking prices are constructed in terms of quality, cost, and contract terms. These clouded conditions are exacerbated by the widely informal nature of rental transactions, typically leaving tenants prey to possible eviction or increases even when they are legally unpermitted. Additionally, the economic meltdown and the rapid and severe devaluation of the Lebanese currency has made the market even more erratic, exacerbated tensions between landlords and existing tenants, and restricted many potential tenants from access to rental housing in Beirut. So today, tenants seek housing in a relatively limited supply of rental units, mostly concentrated in the aging and poorly maintained housing stock, while at least 1 in 4 homeowners prefer to keep their units empty. With low visibility about what to expect to pay and how much, tenants often settle on inadequate housing conditions. Their inability to estimate how much the rent should amount to often leads them to pay higher than they should. It is therefore evident that the lack of transparency in the rental market has contributed to disempowering tenants. The City of Tenants project came as a response to this lack of information. In the absence of public records and amidst high levels of informality and unclear conditions for determining the cost of rent, the project allows tenants to secure information about existing rental conditions in the city. So the platform will help a home seeker answer the basic question of what should I expect to pay for what and where, hence empowering potential tenants with a bargaining tool that would allow them to negotiate terms as they access rental housing in Beirut. Besides providing a platform for potential home seekers, the project produces a much-needed visibility on tenancy that would allow for a more adequate and informed response to rental issues and public policy making. So the Beirut Urban Lab conceived a user-fed geoportal that places information in accessible and clear form at the disposal of home seekers who can explore based on multiple search criteria, existing housing conditions such as apartment characteristics, apartment quality, and actual rental values. The platform provides the geographic distribution of the existing rental arrangements while preserving the anonymity of the users. Through this platform, users may explore details of actual individual rental arrangements across different neighborhoods in Beirut, either directly on the map or in a tabulated format. Aggregated information on average apartment size, average rental value, and other indicators are plotted in a chart format at the neighborhood scale as a comparable reference Filtering surveys along certain preferences such as number of bedrooms, security conditions, provides a more tailored scenario of rent. Hence, information will be available in different formats to be used by tenants to counter their reliance on asking prices, which tend to be inflated, and will enable them to make the choices that serve their needs best. The platform is user-fed. It is a Tenants for Tenants initiative in the sense that it will be informed by actual tenants living in the city who can help those looking to rent in Beirut the possibility to explore how much they should expect to pay in relation to size, location, quality, and other attributes. Through this platform, the tenants of Beirut can expand this knowledge database by recording the characteristics and cost of units they rent. The survey includes questions on household general profile, building characteristics, apartment characteristics, rental contract conditions, and cost of rent. Most of the questions are optional, and users may also choose the research survey, which includes additional questions on the perception and satisfaction of the tenants with the rental arrangement. The platform is also an opportunity to probe the effectiveness of crowdsourcing and user-friendly platforms in a context like Lebanon, where mapathons and crowdsourcing are rarely practiced. To ensure user-friendliness and to reach a wide target audience of city dwellers, we integrated ArcGIS online platform with a custom-developed survey module to overcome the restrictions of Esri credentials and licensing that would usually be limited to experts in the fields. This would allow users to navigate and fill in the data in an easy and accessible form, after which it will be stored in geodatabase format. This project is in its final development phases and is planned to be launched in the coming month. To promote the use of crowdsourcing in a context of low use like Lebanon, the platform will be fed by an initial contribution of 800 surveys from the Beirut Urban Lab's database. Our early findings hint to the injustices created by a liberated and uncurbed rental market. So we see here that although some of the residents in the lower income neighborhoods of the city may be paying lower rent per square meter and a lower total value of rent than other upper income neighborhoods, yet when overlapped with generator bills, private water supply, and other basic utility fees, we can see that residents either pay astronomical fees that exceed the value of rent by far, or refrain from benefiting from these services, which amid the current lack of public infrastructure is considered essential for humane and decent living. The platform also provides a time series to understand how rent has changed over time, showing the difference of what tenants paid when they first moved to the apartment and at the date of the survey. On the long run, the City of Tenants database will also act as a monitor, tracing the changes in Beirut's rental market over time. With information about actual needs and costs that tenants bear and the factors that influence rent, there is a possibility towards the formulation of a responsive public policy. Herein lies the importance of an online and anonymous portal. By providing users with the opportunity to feed information, we hope to generate a dearly needed source of information that can inform users, researchers, and policymakers alike in Beirut and beyond. Thank you. Thank you for bearing with the voice.
Okay, hello everyone. I will now be presenting the most recent knowledge platform of the Beirut Urban Lab called the Beirut Urban Observatory. The project was launched in October 2020 and is one of the BUL's main responses to the Beirut blast. I will be presenting how the platform was conceived and the role it's playing in the recovery process. So, where did the concept of responding to a disaster with an observatory come from? Let's take a look at this map, for example, which visualizes the damage assessment conducted by the Order of Engineers and Architects right after the explosion. Maps such as this one first show the extent of the damage on the city scale, as well as the severe impact of the disasters on both the built environment and living conditions. Yet, as you can see, the assessment only covers a portion of the damaged areas. When we look at this map, we ask several questions. Who will repair these buildings, and up to what norms? What is the social impact of the physical damage? How are the residents reacting to the situation? Will this be a point of entry for actors looking to implement mass gentrification and financialization process? Where is the place of informal settlements in the recovery process? And is anyone looking into the recovery of public spaces and facilities? Immediately after the explosion, BUL researchers were on the field to observe how the relief efforts were taking shape. It immediately became clear that there were hundreds of non-governmental actors intervening without a clear and unified strategy. Spatial coordination for these interventions was not centralized, and there weren't any efficient data collection mechanisms that could help steer the recovery process in the right direction. All of this was taking place amidst a very weak institutional context and without any sort of accountability in the humanitarian sector. This is where the Beirut Built Environment Database emerged as a tool that can not only help us answer these questions, but also support the different actors intervening as part of the recovery. Using the lab's existing knowledge on the city, such as vacancies, ownership, threats to neighborhood, we aim to help NGOs plan their actions in relation to the urban context of Beirut. Our data wasn't the only asset we had, but also our experience in collecting information, especially in contexts of crisis, came in handy. Our GIS teams, researchers, and visualization specialists immediately started working with different organizations on impact assessments, neighborhood profiling, data collection, and other projects to document the crisis using our existing resources and knowledge. This is how the Beirut Urban Observatory was born. The BUO is a knowledge platform established by the Urban Lab as a response to the Beirut blast. It seeks to make sense out of data collected about the city in relation to the Beirut blast and the post-disaster recovery process. Ultimately, the BUO answers questions that were asked by the general public, such as who is intervening, what type of interventions are they conducting, how are they intervening, what are the living conditions in the blast-affected neighborhoods, and where are the gaps in the recovery. The observatory also seeks to facilitate coordination amongst NGOs by trying to build an environment of trust amongst them and give visibility to their work and the different challenges they are encountering. The work conducted as part of the observatory is divided into different themes investigated by the Urban Lab and our partners. Furthermore, it helps us link these different themes across one another. To do so, we use the BBED, which Habib presented, as a baseline for our research, and then map the different information we gathered against what we know about Beirut. We engage with the recovery processes with our maps to show how the different thematics materialize across the neighborhoods. I will only speak about a couple of these tracks, as my colleagues will now go more in depth on the others. Nevertheless, if you want to get a full picture of the various platforms the observatory has developed, you would have to spend time browsing its pages. One of our research tracks is looking into different repair modalities adopted by the NGOs following the explosion. We interviewed 38 organizations that conducted residential repairs after the blast and managed to establish a working relationship with 22 of these organizations who agreed to share with us the location of their interventions so we can map them. One of our primary objectives is to give visibility over the process of repairs, the organizations that are conducting them, and the areas where they work. Even though our dataset does not cover the entirety of the city or the actors who worked, you can immediately notice two different spatial trends in the map. Some NGOs worked in cluster by concentrating their efforts in a particular area, while others chose to spread their interventions across the city. This map also gives us a better idea of who worked where and how. We are currently looking into if and how the differences in repair standards actually translate into different recovery patterns on the neighborhood and city scales. One thing is clear though, this map clearly shows that residents of Beirut are not all experiencing one comprehensive and unified recovery process. These maps are also an opportunity to support the NGOs when it comes to coordinating with other actors and better understand the context in which they are intervening. At the end of the day, one of our main objectives is to support the coordination process, and that is why we are always seeking new partnerships and cooperation with the humanitarian sector. Through the observatory, we are working on building trust amongst these actors and derive lessons from the recovery process. The next step for the analysis was to differentiate the actors by type. Here, we simply split the data sets between national and international organizations. Again, as you can see, both types work closely, oftentimes in the same building, sometimes in the same apartment. During our research on repair modalities, we realized that international NGOs have a more standardized and systemic approach to post-disaster recovery, while local organizations are much more scattered in their approach. This map is therefore evidence that inequities in repair have a spatial dimension and that they are occurring across the city. When we zoom out, we also notice particular areas of concentration of one of the types at the city level. The red clusters are areas where international organizations dominated, while blue areas show a concentration of national actors. We also notice the gaps in between these clusters, which leaves us wondering about who worked in these neighborhoods and whether there were particular NGOs or types of NGOs that dominated the repair scene in these areas. On the other hand, We also looked at the recovery of collective spaces and institutions in the city. We are constantly looking into and mapping the different interventions on public spaces by either working with NGOs or conducting field research ourselves. We are also working to coordinate these different interventions, as well as highlighting opportunities and gaps that are presenting themselves. We are always working with the different NGOs to empower them with information and advice on where to intervene and how to respond to the needs of a particular neighborhood or community. This map shows the different projects we identified across the city, and it immediately becomes clear that there are particular poles of concentration around Karantina, Jumaizeh, Mar Mkhail, and Hikmeh, while very little care and attention are being given to the rest of Beirut. Of course, we are not only looking into reconstruction, but also the recovery of housing conditions and the local economy. One of our research tracks looks into the recovery of the Jumaizeh Mar Mkhail commercial spine. These series of maps show that a significant percentage of businesses are yet to reopen since the blast. We use this information alongside other research we conduct on the return of residents to their neighborhoods and the social practices occurring in nearby public space to assess living conditions in the blast-affected neighborhoods several months after the disaster. Using the data we gathered about the recovery, we are now working on creating a return to life score, which my colleague Suha will present.
So aside from monitoring return to life along the Jumaizeh Mar Mkhail strip, okay, this is not working, excuse me. So aside from monitoring return to life along the Mar Mkhail Jumaizeh strip, the observatory has mapped 6 clusters distributed in the neighborhoods affected by the port blast, where focus was mainly on inhabitants. While most monitoring of recovery has been measured through the number of units repaired, we hope to shift the focus to residents returning to their homes. The cluster survey seeks to monitor the movement of residents in the neighborhood, when and how it happens, across current inhabitants, with an array of factors that we believe influenced this movement, such as the repair of units, proximity to the blast, heritage classification of buildings, mode of occupancy, and more. By movement, we point both to return, but also to evictions, given that a sizable percentage of residents expect inability to stay in place for long. The selection of clusters hope to focus on a number of scenarios or factors that we know to be replicable across the city, such as the profile of residents, for example, Syrian refugees or migrant workers, the development activity, the classification of buildings, and the quality of building development. So based on these criteria, we selected first 2 clusters with predatory real estate development interests, 1 cluster where the location of an unimplemented road project has been squatted for decades, 1 cluster located within a neighborhood historically developed as a refugee camp, 1 mixed income cluster that includes both heritage buildings and recent high-end developments, and finally, 1 cluster with striking external repairs. The plan is to monitor return and ability to stay every 4 months in these clusters as a pilot method that can be adopted elsewhere. Monitoring phases and results will soon be out on the platform of the Beirut Urban Observatory. Within all 6 clusters, return indicators were articulated on several levels. So at the neighborhood level scale, we particularly looked at open space usage and sidewalk disruptions. At the building level, we looked at repair status, open and closed businesses. And at the apartment level, we looked at vacancy, repair, and displacement patterns. We also analyzed property titles and property records to identify and link these urban trends mentioned earlier with these indicators. Our initial findings across all 6 clusters show that half of the units within these clusters are still vacant 18 months after the blast. The time of repair varies considerably across households. So several households never left or returned in less than 2 weeks only. The first wave of returnees traced so far, as we can see here on the graph, ended 6 months after the blast. A few more also returned 1 year later. It also seems that there's ever since like six months later, the return plateaued somehow. We further note that half of the occupied units also still require repair. We also looked at the clusters comparatively. So using the dashboard, we mapped occupancy rates, repair statuses, number of eviction threats, status of ground floor businesses, and observed sidewalk disruptions to compose what we were calling and labeling for now return to life score. Clearly, conditions vary from one cluster to another, and reality is not necessarily as expected, actually. So, for example, one might expect a higher-end cluster like Mar Mikhail to recover so much faster than a cluster housing Syrian refugees like Karantina. The platform shows that this is not actually the case. Karantina residents returned much faster than the Mar Mikhail residents. So in Mar Mikhail, return and recovery is so much slower. Of course, we can't make generalizations, but however, these readings still challenge us to conduct more in-depth analysis and investigation on why this is the case. So are fast returnees coming back because they have no other option, while better off residents have the luxury to wait? Looking at the Mar Mikhail cluster, this can give us somehow insights on how return is, on how we can read return and all of these elements and factors. So this cluster has the highest vacancy rate among all clusters, with 9 out of 15 buildings still fully vacant. These fully vacant buildings have not been repaired yet, and several have severe structural damage. Several buildings are also classified as heritage by the DGA, which approves repair only using high-end material. In times of financial crises, such criteria disrupts repair and return. A few old buildings also have contested inheritance issues or real estate development capital stored in them. On the upper side of the main strip, new developments have not been repaired yet because insurance companies refuse to cover repair costs. Unrepaired buildings sometimes also delay the recovery of commercial activities. Around half of the ground floor businesses in Mar Mikhail, this cluster specifically, are open, even in severely damaged buildings that require structural repair. The delayed return of residents is also alarming to business owners who actually rely on neighborhood scale demands such as grocery stores. In addition, debris and scaffolding still fill up the sidewalks, causing disruptions in sidewalk circulation and hence slowing return to life. This cluster analysis allows us to detect inconsistencies in the recovery, not only across clusters. Finally, return is mostly about people's ability to stay in their homes, in their businesses, and open spaces. So in this cluster, at least 5 households have been threatened with eviction. Across all clusters, 1/3 of returnees reported being threatened with eviction, which shows the need to address return and recovery not only in times of crises, but also more generally to address the citywide economic trends that have disrupted people's livelihoods for the past 30 years.
To conclude, the Beirut Urban Observatory monitors the impact of the Beirut blast on the city and how the recovery process is being shaped by the different responses. Sorry, we're back to the same problem. Just a second.
We're having technical issues.
Okay, I'll try to improvise. To conclude, the Beirut Urban Observatory monitors the impact of the Beirut blast on the city and how the recovery process is being shaped by the different responses. It acts as a knowledge platform for the public, policymakers, and stakeholders by providing visibility over the damages, the processes of repair, and the daily struggle of Beiruti residents. Our platforms are capable of providing data that can steer the recovery process towards being actually more inclusive and more sustainable, and actually trying to make the best out of the interventions that are currently occurring across the city. We use different tools to feed the platform, such as field data collection, conducting interviews, conducting surveys, and also working with the different partners from the humanitarian and the different type of stakeholders to try and cooperate with them, steer the coordination process. And we hope that the Beirut Urban Observatory will shape the basis of the project we've been lobbying for, which is creating a central coordination unit at the government of Beirut that can institutionalize the work we've been doing at the Beirut Urban Lab. Thank you very much for the time you've given us, and we hope you enjoyed our presentation.
Wow. Thank you so much. And I don't even know where to start, because I think the tools that you have presented and the information that you have shown is just, I think, so valuable. I think it's going from archives and memories to, really big data analysis, geomapping, but then also the depth that you go into the specific neighborhoods and qualitative research that you have brought to the fore, that I think each of these presentations and each of these tools would merit its own panel to go deeper. And I will maybe at the end try to bring some of these issues together and share my observations, but let me first invite David, our discussant, to join me up here to share his observations before we open up for some more comments.
Thank you, Melanie. Yes. Well, first of all, let me join Melanie in congratulating you. It's really impressive to see such an army of ants, I want to say, really working on research and wholeheartedly, pouring yourself into these projects and these topics. So congratulations to you and to the rest of the team. Really interesting topics, really interesting information. I feel like we dug a little bit into this machine that we already know about, superficially. We see the outcome of your work, but we really never understood how all of this functions. So I'm privileged to have an insight to all of that. To tell you the truth, I was taking lots of notes during the presentation, and I thought I would be commenting on many things, but suddenly in the middle of the presentation something clicked, and I would like to start with that. I was very critical. I'm always very critical, about, and maybe skeptical also about all this data, all this research, and what is the outcome of all of that, and how are we going to use this, and who is going to be the, the beneficial at the end of the day. We always think it's going to be the researchers itself. It's going to be maybe the part that is granting also, because it's marketing for them. So, but for us and for me, it's always like lots of questions, and we try to do the best we can to do the best, to bring the best outcome. But suddenly, during your presentation, I saw the City of Tenants project, and suddenly I felt like at some point, yes, this could be beneficial for the end user, the people that we are researching about. Those, how do we say, cobayes in French, in English. The people that we spend times looking at, we go to their homes, we go to their flats, we go to the streets, we talk to their kids, we come back to the office, we say, yeah, they're so cute, I found this and I found that. But suddenly I feel like at some point this project can be beneficial for them. And if this platform, or maybe lots of other platforms that I've seen during this presentation, can become of use, and can help, give those people something. out of all this can be amazing. And I truly believe after this presentation that we can get somewhere. This was what I wanted to start with. Of course, I really like the sequencing of your presentation. I thought it was, I'm sure it was intentional, but starting from the historical, archiving, the unarchiving, going through these different events. And I think it was yesterday when Robert was pointing out that these research start from events, and you mentioned the pandemic, the COVID, and maybe the blast, and then you go to the digitization of all this information when you talk about the BBED, and finally the observatory that comes and gathers all this information and maybe do some analysis, and comes up at the end of the day with these guidelines, and what should be done. So I thought the layout, I thought the sequencing of all your presentation made lots of sense. There was lots of information, very tough to process, I'm sure, for Melanie as well. But I think it made sense because it followed a certain logic. And this is, I think, what all of this means today, trying to make sense out of all this data processing, because it's not easy to process at the end of the day. I also wanted to mention something that is important for me as well as a researcher, because the more I look at data and the more I look at different approaches, I feel that maybe in Beirut today, the best way to approach or to try to help the city is to look at the clusters, the smallest clusters in the city, because the more we look at the city and the more we live the city, I at least personally feel that the city cannot be dealt as a city anymore. We have crossed maybe, and I'm sure lots of people will disagree maybe, but I feel that we crossed the line between the city and the cluster. We need to find, and I always say this in many, everywhere that I go, I feel like we need to define new tools to develop, to talk about how we can help, how we can develop new strategies, and I think it starts with understanding the clusters, and I've seen this today during your presentation that really the focus is on the cluster, the unit. And the city is, when we see those big maps about Beirut and different colors, land use and all this, and I believe that today this is not relevant anymore. I believe that it's very difficult, to find common points, even though it's a small city. So it's more important for us as researchers, for you, to look at the smallest clusters, to look at these units between those divisions, inside the neighborhoods as well. It's not even neighborhoods, it's divisions within neighborhoods. And try to come up with stuff like City of Tenants or other projects that can really be beneficial. I think, in summary, this is my impression of this presentation. I would have liked really to go more in details, but I don't think we have time. I would like to hear maybe you guys or maybe other questions about that. So thank you very much. This was really, really interesting and revealing for me.
Thank you so much, David, for these thoughtful observations and for, I think, confirming to our group, you called it our aunts, I would say, the group of brains here that we have, who have developed these different tools. And I think what you have said about the City of Tenants is very interesting, because it is, all of your presentations showed to me the striking thing, and as I said, I'm in week 4 here in Beirut, of the impact of the absence of regulations and our public policies, right? And I think what you, on the other hand, do is you show how you can inform public policy and how you can have a data-driven approach to saying, these are the dynamics and to be a part of that. So I think that was, for me, very striking, and I think that's is, but also at the same time, as you have said, how you can make it available to the people of Beirut, and I think that comes back what I said at the beginning. How can we work together with what we are doing to bring some of these tools to the communities that we work with? And I would be also interested to see, and maybe opening the question myself before I open it to the public, to you, is how you see what you would like to see as next steps for your respective tools, how to bring that to the public, or how to bring that to the different policymakers.
I would like to answer you both on something, how this is used by the public or not used by the public. And I think really to know that answer, you have to feel it on the ground and you have to work on the field. I would like to narrate a very small story that happened with me in Quarantina in the second oral history platform, which I think some of you might think it's only poetic or just digging, and I don't want to go into that fake nostalgia or romanticizing the past. But one old man, I was talking to him and I explained briefly the project, and I wanted them to narrate on their own what is the archive to them. And he told me, أنا الأرشيف, I am the archive. Yeah. And it was striking because he was the archive. So I think once I know public policies matter, and I know rent matters a lot, and I know eviction matters a lot, but also because we are living in a state of psychosis, I think we really need that part of the archive, which is always developing, even now. We are sitting here in a nice, very neat hall, but on the ground, people need to narrate their story, especially in that specific area, which is really concealed. We do not have a national narrative for our country. We do not have a unified history book, so I think we should start always from there and maybe add the additional layers that are crucial for the public.
Thank you, Victoria. Thank you so much.
I want to refer to what Professors Fawaz and Harib were talking about earlier on, is that on one side it's really hard we shouldn't let go of this will to see our public agencies being more involved in planning our city, but at the same time we have to accept that different actors from different scales are de facto planners in Beirut. And one of the main targets of the Observatory is pointing out that these de facto planners can actually reunite around a unified vision, and can actually make informed decision-making. I think, and this is something Soha highlighted, is that the recovery process is not unified. It really diverses across the different neighborhoods. And I think this also should reflect in how we approach our policies, or even the NGOs' actions after the blast, that because the impact of the blast and the recovery are not being felt as one, therefore our policies and our decisions should not be general across the entire city and should take into account the diversities between the neighborhoods. And this is what we're trying to push for as much as we can through mapping, through data, and through also taking these narratives and spatializing them across the city.
I also want to add a couple of examples on how we can take these projects and actually to implement on-ground implementation and advocate for certain things. So, for example, a lot of groups are talking about bringing back housing loans in the coming years. And so, for example, one of the things that one can do is to show the map which shows the segregation of housing loans versus the high-end development, and show how housing loans actually caused certain class segmentations in the city for us not to repeat the same thing again. So this is one example. Another one, for example, would be currently the demolition of the grain silos. A lot of people are saying they should be demolished. A lot of people are saying let's reinforce the grain silos. And so if I compare this to my memory of the Civil War, I absolutely have no memory of the Civil War because there wasn't anything renovated that showed like the remains of the Civil War, except for very recently, only a couple of years ago, BBED Beirut. And so from that perspective, I believe that we can use such tools, such platforms, such researches to actually in advocacy also, not only to say that we're doing research. Another example would be, it's going to be presented in the next panel, the Masar Akhdar project. If we haven't done research on this planned road and understood the struggles of these people and the dilapidated conditions they're living in, we wouldn't have been able to say that we should do an intervention on this trip. Yeah. So aside from City of Tenants, of course. So these are just examples I just wanted to mention. Thanks.
Thank you. Yeah, thank you. I think you have already stated what the City of Tenants project would actually do in relation to the users and the city dwellers. But yeah, it actually, when we tried to study the rental law of Lebanon, we noticed that it's in a continuous state of exceptions since the 1920s. So there's always just an amendment which provides an exception for an additional 2 or 3 years. Until today, it remains in the same state, which has created this condition of ambiguity and cloudedness in the rental market. And as a response from us as urban researchers and urban planners, at the current state, in order to provide, in the meantime, since we live in a failed state, what we thought we can do is by providing more visibility to city dwellers, it would actually empower them as a bargaining tool. So instead of the state regulating the market, this is the way where we can, in a sense, regulate it, yes, but without actually regulating it at the state level. So, yeah.
I just wanted to elaborate a bit on the idea of who this research benefits, because yes, of course, it's a very exciting project for us as researchers to have this amount of data and be able to theorize and do nice maps. But it's not just the people who can benefit directly from platforms like City of Tenants. I mean, a lot of this research is done not in absence of regulation, but really responding to very intentional regulations and laws that were put in place. For example, the central bank policy that has been going on for the past 20 years has really incentivized capital investment in real estate. And doing such mapping exercises really allows us to see the manifestation on the ground of such policy. Also, a very important law to mention is the 2004 building law, which really changed exploitation factors in the city. And after talking to policymakers, we understood that the rationale that was used to justify the building law was we need better environmental codes for buildings to be erected in Beirut. But really what it ended up doing is really changing the exploitation factor in ways that really see the apartment as a number of meters square and how much the developer can sell and build on a certain plot of land of a certain area. And this is something which we cannot really prove or advocate for without having reliable and mapped data like the ones we're trying to do. So it's really not only informing public policy, but understanding what the history of public policy has produced. So I think this is one of the major benefits of such research.
This is where the loop,
Yeah, I mean, it's an iterative process.
Everything makes sense.
All the way, for sure. Thank you.
Great. I think briefly, all the platforms are a tool of planning for me.
Yeah.
And they reinvent tools of planning.
I just wanted to highlight that they were discussing on zooming into understanding people's struggles. Meanwhile, the research Mona Harib and I do is kind of zoom out onto governance structures and understand the power that's power structures between different actors such as the government, NGOs, people on the ground, in order to kind of inform policy making and informs how to govern a crisis. So it all like interconnects with each other, understanding people's struggles on one point and understanding governance on a larger scale on another point. Yeah, just wanted to highlight.
Absolutely. And maybe allow me, listening to you, I think you have been extremely comprehensive in what, how this can be used, how we should use it. But from where I sit, I think you can also help us. I mean, you have, I think, with the Urban Observatory, you have showed it quite clearly, and we have done our own research, and I'm here with my colleague Roland, who has done a lot of that in Quarantina, on how often, we call it in sociology unintended consequences of good intentions. And that is what is guided. I've been working in over 18 years in development and peace building, and there is a lot what was started with good intentions, but then didn't end like that, and a lot of it was often also related to insufficient coordination and insufficient strategic planning. And I think there I see a huge opportunity for us, I think, to continue to work together and to bring this research to our colleagues. So I will come back to you and Mona for, I think, a presentation of some of these tools for our colleagues who then plan interventions. I think one additional point, and I think it was mentioned as I came in the last panel, that I can see is how can we use all of the insights that you have. I think, Antoine, you mentioned it in a coordination for the Beirut governorate. But I think a bit more generically, how can all of this inform preparedness for next potential shocks? And I don't think that is necessarily only expecting, the worst, but I'm just looking at climate change and the environment. If we are talking, we will expect that not only in Beirut, and you see it now outside of Beirut I think I read the other day, the Bekaa Valley, which was very affected by the storms, is to say how all of this data for a city that is moving forward, and we are working with cities globally in UNDP to work on preparedness. And I think to work on preparedness for natural disasters. And I think there's a lot of insights to be had there, and I think that builds on all the work that you have said in terms of regulations, but also building structures and building codes. But I was only asked to moderate, and I feel I've already talked far too much for that. So let us see if David and we have the audience, but you definitely inspired me. So I take that as a good point. But let's open up the floors to the huge audience here to add their thoughts, comments, and questions. Please.
I want to react to the issue that was raised by David. What's being done here, it's a new way of doing politics. What you are doing is a political act. What Beirut Urban Lab is doing is political. I mean, it's not just statistics and I don't know what. And when you say politics, this means that it is directly linked to the life of people and to the tenants and other than tenants. I mean, everybody. This is what's important, the political dimension of your action.
Thank you so much. Let's maybe collect a few interventions and questions and then get back to David and our researchers.
I think we've used up all our time.
we also have no more interventions.
If there are no more interventions, no more interventions, no problem.
Absolutely. Good. David, do you want to come in?
You can conclude.
Do we have any more comments from our researchers? I think if not, then I think I would like to congratulate you again and thank you again for the amazing work that you have been doing, and good luck with launching the different tools. We will definitely follow that, and very much looking forward to working with you to bringing this in the broader public, and also to making it very useful to our planning and to all what we do. Thanks a lot.
Thank you.
And the lunch is served in the same space as earlier. Please join us. We can continue our chats there. We reconvene at 3:30.